Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Talk Speak podcast. Today, we're diving deep into the evolving U.S. strategy in the Middle East. We're looking beyond the usual headlines, really comparing the approaches of the Trump and Biden administrations.
It's a fascinating comparison, definitely. We've got this really insightful report that looks at U.S. diplomacy, strategy, particularly the economic and defense ties with the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Right.
And we'll touch on things like this idea of a Middle East NATO, policies on Iran, Syria, the role of energy, OPEC, and even how Europe views all these shifts.
Exactly. And our mission today, for you listening, is to sort of cut through all that complexity. We want to pull out the key insights from this report, give you a clear picture of how U.S. policy has been changing in this really vital region without getting bogged down in, endless detail, hopefully with some surprising facts, maybe a few aha moments.
And you really do see these two quite distinct styles emerging from the White House. You've got the Trump administration's very transactional America First angle.
The deal making.
Exactly. And then you contrast that with the Biden administration putting the focus back on alliances, values, and using economic tools, economic statecraft a bit more. It's a really sharp difference in how they've engaged with the Middle East.
Okay, let's dig into that, starting with the Trump years. The report really paints a picture of an administration running on a deal-based, interest-first kind of principle. It wasn't so much about spreading traditional values, was it? More about concrete economic and security wins.
Absolutely. That prioritization of tangible benefits is very clear. The report shows how they were actively going after these huge investment deals, big arms sales with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar.
Seen as markers of success.
Very much so. Completing those deals was seen as, a key sign of diplomatic progress. It wasn't just business as usual. It was central to their whole strategy in the region.
You mentioned energy. They were also pushing the domestic oil and gas industry pretty hard back then. That must have played into their Middle East approach.
Oh, undoubtedly. And alongside that, there was this consistent message, this push for allies over there to carry more of the weight on security.
Shoulder more responsibility.
Exactly. Reduce the U.S. military footprint. That idea of burden sharing, it's a really strong thread in the America First thinking described in the report.
Okay, but what about the potential downsides? Focusing so hard on the immediate deal, the short-term gain.
Yeah.
Could that maybe miss some longer-term issues for the region?
That's a really critical point the analysis brings up. This short-term focus, it might have sidelined efforts towards long-term stability in the region. And there's always a risk, isn't there, of oversimplifying really complex geopolitics when everything's viewed mainly through that transactional lens. And maybe a bit paradoxically, that strong America First message could have actually made some allies wonder about how reliable the U.S. commitment was long-term.
Leading them to look elsewhere?
China?
Russia?
Potentially, yeah. Prompting them to diversify their relationships, which might not align with broader U.S. strategic goals down the road.
Okay, so let's switch gears to the Biden administration. The report describes a different approach, trying to repair alliances, bringing human rights more to the forefront, using economic levers for diplomacy.
Yes, but the report also highlights the, let's say, practical hurdles. You see examples like releasing oil from the strategic reserves, which didn't really move the needle much on global prices.
Right.
Or the feeling that they got a bit of a diplomatic cold shoulder from OPEC when they asked for production increases. It shows how tricky it is to actually wield that economic influence effectively.
And the environmental angle is a huge contrast, too. Rejoining the Paris Agreement, canceling Keystone XL, very different signals compared to Trump.
Totally different. And human rights playing a much more visible role in Biden's foreign policy, another key difference the report points out. But that creates its own tension, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, how do you square that emphasis on values with the reality of needing to work with partners, authoritarian partners sometimes, in the short term, all while trying to aim for something more sustainable, more value-based long-term? It's a real balancing act.
Yeah, I can see that. And the report mentions domestic issues, too, like inflation, gas prices here in the U.S.
Yeah.
How those things can really shape diplomatic moves in the Middle East, domestic and foreign policy getting intertwined.
Absolutely. And that ties into how these different administrations were actually received in the region, specifically by key players like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. The report suggests the difference in reception was, pretty noticeable.
Yeah. It mentioned these almost royal-level welcomes for Trump fighter jet escorts, big send-offs.
Right.
And these massive investment figures being announced. Like, what was it? A reported $600 billion commitment from Saudi Arabia. Over $1 trillion in economic exchange with Qatar. Hundreds of billions in deals. $1.4 trillion pledged by the UAE over 10 years. Those numbers are just staggering.
They really are. And what the report emphasizes is the importance placed on personal chemistry in those Trump-era interactions. It specifically talks about that strong rapport seemingly built between Trump and leaders like the Saudi crown prince.
Personal diplomacy driving the deals.
It seems to have been a big factor, yes. That personal connection helped grease the wheels for these huge agreements. It highlights that human element in diplomacy.
Which, according to the report, contrasts with maybe cooler reception sometimes for Biden administration officials visiting the same Gulf states.
That's what's suggested. And the report floats this idea that maybe some Gulf leaders actually prefer a U.S. president who is less, shall we say, vocal on human rights issues and more focused on that direct leader-to-leader economic and security partnership model.
Because it aligns better with their style.
Possibly. It might fit better with their own governance and immediate strategic needs.
But then the report raises that crucial point, relying too heavily on personal relationships. What happens when leaders change? Or relationships sour? It seems risky for policy stability.
It introduces a huge element of uncertainty, exactly. Now, digging into the actual economics, the report gets specific about these big U.S. Gulf deals. It's definitely more than just handshakes.
Yeah, serious money and hardware involved. Let's start with defense. Big arms sales to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. For the Saudis, it mentions a near $142 billion defense sales agreement, possibly the largest ever.
That's the figure reported, covering things like Air Force upgrades, missile defense, border security, command systems, a whole range.
And this builds on an earlier announcement from 2017.
Right, that $110 billion intention announced in 2017, though the report notes only about $14.5 billion of that had reportedly materialized by 2018. So big numbers announced, but delivery takes time. It also mentions ongoing talks about potential F-35 sales and specific approvals for 2025, like AM-120 missiles and APKWS rockets.
Okay, and Qatar. Also huge numbers, over $243 billion in military and economic deals mentioned, including a big Boeing order.
A $96 billion Boeing order, yeah. And on the defense side specifically, nearly $2 billion for MQ-9B Reaper drones, those advanced surveillance and strike UAVs, and $1 billion for Raytheon's anti-drone system, FSLAD.
And those drone deals were approved recently. March 2025, signed May 2025.
That's what the report indicates, yes. Then for the UAE, over $200 billion in total transactions. Specifics include approvals in May 2025 for Chinook helicopters, $1.32 billion worth, and another $1.6 billion for Chinook parts and F-16 components. The UAE is a major foreign military sales, or FMS, partner for the U.S.
And the suppliers, Boeing, Raytheon, General Atomics, Lockheed Martin, the big U.S. defense names, are all over these deals, according to the report.
They certainly are. And the strategic goal behind all this, the report suggests, is building a more capable, more interoperable security network among these Gulf allies. Think integrated air defense, modern air forces. It really underpins that whole Middle East NATO idea.
Aimed primarily at Iran.
Primarily countering Iran, yes. And the report points to an acceleration in these sales efforts to streamline the FMS process.
Why the push to speed things up?
The implication is maybe a prioritization of these strategic partnerships and defense industry interests, perhaps with less weight given to human rights concerns or potential impacts on regional stability compared to previous approaches.
Okay, so beyond arms, the report looks at other sectors, energy, tech, infrastructure. Again, massive investments reported. Saudi Arabia's $600 billion commitment. What does that cover?
It includes things like $20 billion by a company called DataVolt for AI data centers and energy infrastructure, and a projected $80 billion from giants like Google, DataVolt again, Oracle, focusing on advanced tech. There's also cooperation mentioned in mining, and this partnership with NVIDIA to build AI factories.
AI factories, wow. Specific companies named, specific projects. It sounds very targeted towards their diversification plans.
Very much so. And for the UAE, the number is even bigger, $1.4 trillion pledged over 10 years. A key part is a tech agreement to import loads of advanced NVIDIA AI chips, like 500,000 a year, starting 2025.
500,000 AI chips a year. That's huge.
It is. Plus a big Boeing order for Etihad Airways, $14.5 billion, and plans for a major AI data center in Abu Dhabi.
And Qatar. A different structure, but still massive, $1.2 trillion in economic exchange mentioned, and a $1 billion investment in quantum tech with a company called Quantinuum.
That's right. So you see this trend. The U.S. apparently planning to boost access to advanced chips, NVIDIA, AMD for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, despite those concerns about China maybe getting access. The report suggests Trump was particularly willing to transfer this kind of advanced tech.
And the strategic rationale is countering China's tech influence, building a Western tech ecosystem there.
That seems to be the idea, yes, while acknowledging the risk of technology leakage. But crucially, these investments align perfectly with the Gulf states' own vision plans, diversifying their economies, boosting their global influence. So a transactional U.S. approach becomes a potentially very useful partner for them.
But then the report brings us back down to earth a bit, talking about the gap between the handshake and the actual hardware delivery. These headline numbers aren't always what they seem immediately.
Exactly. It's a really important reality check. It uses that 2017 Saudi $110 billion arms deal example again, where only a fraction materialized quickly. The new $142 billion Saudi deal is described as ongoing. These big announcements often bundle MOUs, letters of intent, long-term promises, things already in the pipeline.
Not all brand new cash on the table.
Not necessarily, no. And even with efforts to reform the FMS process, it's still complex. Regulatory hurdles, industry capacity, the ability of the receiving country to actually absorb and use the tech, it all takes time, often years, spanning presidencies.
So those trillion-dollar figures for the UAE, for instance, being spread over 10 years.
Yeah.
That makes more sense in that context.
Precisely. It's about the long game, potential future benefits, job creation down the line.
Okay, let's tackle this Middle East NATO concept. The report links it to cash, pipelines, drones, and chips, echoing that earlier MESA idea Middle East Strategic Alliance from the Trump era. What was MESA about?
MESA aimed to bring together the GCC states, plus Egypt and Jordan, mainly to counter Iran, but also terrorism, cyber threats. It was about coordinating on security, managing conflicts, boosting trade.
And this Middle East NATO, is it a formal treaty like the actual NATO?
The report suggests it's less formal, more like a U.S.-led framework built on all these bilateral and multilateral security deals, the tech cooperation, the economic ties we've been discussing. The goal is similar: get Arab partners sharing more of the burden against Iran, managing regional issues, but it's more of a network than a rigid alliance.
But its success depends on continued U.S. leadership.
Yeah.
And getting past all the internal rivalries in the region.
Absolutely crucial. Overcoming those divisions and differing threat perceptions is key. And when you look at the pillars, the report mentions oil cooperation, drone sales, AI chips, shared security worries.
Mainly Iran, terrorism, maritime security.
Right. You see how it's meant to work. But this reliance on advanced tech, like AI and drones, creates a new kind of strategic dependence on the U.S. It gives Washington leverage, but also means they have to be really careful about tech security.
And the report argues that while Iran is a big motivator, the economic and tech pillars might be just as important for keeping Gulf states engaged, because it fits their own development plans.
That's a key takeaway. It aligns with their vision goals. But the report is also realistic about the challenges. MESA itself stumbled over differing priorities, perceptions it served U.S.-Saudi interests mainly, inconsistent U.S. focus, the Qatar crisis splitting the GCC. Kuwait and Oman weren't overly keen either.
So Trump's deal-making might secure bilateral wins, but maybe struggles to build that deeper multilateral trust needed for a real security alliance.
That's the suggestion. Plus, you have China and Russia becoming more influential, offering alternatives, making a purely U.S.-centric structure harder to maintain. Regional states might want to balance their relationships.
Okay, let's shift to Iran and the maximum pressure campaign. The Trump administration really ramped this up. What was the reported economic impact?
It definitely hurt Iran's economy significantly in Trump's first term, according to the report. NSPM2 formalized it, aiming for zero oil exports, waves of sanctions. It led to high inflation, currency collapse, serious unemployment in Iran.
But did it achieve the main goal of stopping their nuclear program?
No. The report states clearly it didn't force them to abandon the nuclear program, though it did reportedly cause setbacks for their regional proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah leadership losses, operational difficulties, disrupted supply lines, treasury actions against financiers.
So it weakened Iran and its network. But what were the potential downsides or negative consequences of that strategy?
Well, one major concern raised is that it might have actually pushed Iran to accelerate its nuclear program, either as leverage or a deterrent. That increases proliferation risks.
Right.
And squeezing the proxies' funding could push them towards illicit activities like drug trafficking, creating new kinds of security problems.
Which brings us to the nuclear stalemate. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA deal in 2018. Iran advanced its program. Now, the report mentioned something interesting, that Tehran might actually prefer dealing with Trump again over Biden. Why?
The thinking seems to be that Trump, being more transactional and maybe unpredictable, might offer a quicker, more direct deal for sanctions relief, even if it's less stable, compared to Biden, who might be seen as more demanding on broader issues beyond just the nuclear file.
So any future talks would be really tough. Iran demanding guarantees against another U.S. withdrawal, wanting to keep the focus narrow.
Exactly. The failure of the JCPOA casts a long shadow. They'd likely resist including missile programs or regional behavior in the talks.
And looking at the regional balance, Trump's strong alliances with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, it kind of encircled Iran. Plus, the potential fall of Assad in Syria was seen as a big blow.
Yes, losing Syria as a key logistical hub would have significantly weakened their proxy network. But despite being more isolated and pressured, Iran kept developing its nuclear capability.
So the report suggests a weakened Iran, maybe more isolated, might actually become more reliant on asymmetric tactics and its nuclear program as the ultimate insurance policy, potentially more unpredictable.
That's the risk highlighted. And the shifting alliances, like more Arab states normalizing ties with Israel, further isolates Iran, but could also increase the chances of regional conflict through miscalculation.
Now, Syria, the report hints at a potentially big shift in U.S. policy there. Sanctions relief mentioned. A meeting with an interim president, Ahmed Saleh. That sounds like a major change from the Caesar Act sanctions under Trump's first term.
It would be a significant departure, yes. The report suggests the aim might be to pave the way for Syria's reconstruction, attract investment, maybe allow U.S. companies to get involved in rebuilding. It frames it as a pragmatic move, acknowledging new realities, prioritizing stability in business, potentially trying to build influence with new leadership, even given past concerns.
And this apparent shift surprised some former Trump officials, suggesting a top-down decision.
That's what the report indicates, yeah. And it notes that this move, the meeting with Saleh, was welcomed by some Arab leaders as a potential new beginning. The new Syrian government is reportedly seeking U.S. and Gulf support, even talking with the Kurdish SDF.
And interestingly, the report says the sanctions relief was supposedly requested by Saudi Crown Prince MBS. That highlights the influence of allies again.
It really does, the potential goals.
Oh.
Maybe pulling Syria out of Iran's orbit, weakening Russia's foothold there, reshaping the whole Levant. But success depends entirely on whether this new Syrian regime is stable and willing to align with U.S. Gulf interests.
So allied influence, transactional diplomacy, it all seems interconnected based on the report.
Very much so. Now, shifting to OPEC in the energy game. The report contrasts Biden's limited success in getting OPEC to pump more oil with Trump's apparent ability to get tacit production increases.
It mentions Trump directly leaning on Saudi Arabia and OPEC to boost output, lower prices, pressure Russia, and OPEC Plus responding differently under the two administrations.
Yes, but the report adds crucial context. OPEC's decisions are mainly driven by their own collective economic interests, balancing supply and demand for target prices and internal group cohesion, not just by who's in the White House.
Makes sense. But maybe a U.S. administration seen as more pro-fossil fuel, like Trump's, finds it easier to get cooperation when U.S. goals align with OPEC's, like pressuring Iran or Russia.
That's plausible, yes.
Huh.
The report explores how oil is used as a tool affecting inflation, pressuring adversaries. Lower prices help the U.S. control inflation and squeeze oil-reliant rivals.
And Biden used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, to try and lower gas prices here.
He did. And the report notes that for Saudi Arabia, U.S. sanctions on competitors like Russia and Iran are often a key factor before they'll consider raising their own production. It's a complex interplay.
But trying to manipulate global oil prices is risky. Could backfire domestically or internationally.
High stakes, definitely. It can hurt U.S. producers, potentially fracture OPEC plus MER. Using the SPR is seen as more of a short-term fix. Trump's talk of refilling the SPR would actually support prices long-term.
Okay, finally, let's look at European perspectives. The report says Europeans had reservations about Trump bypassing allies, his direct deals with Gulf leaders, his pragmatic stance on human rights, and his generally unfriendly view of the EU.
Right. And the report suggests Europe might need to rethink its relationship if faced with unpredictable U.S. leadership again. A U.S. focus on bilateral transactional deals could weaken the transatlantic partnership and the EU's collective global influence.
And Europeans worried about being sidelined on key Middle East issues, like Iran, regional stability. Could that push the EU towards more independent actions?
That's the concern, potentially leading to divergence from U.S. policy. And the report stresses the core difference: Europe's strong emphasis on human rights versus the Trump administration's pragmatism. The EU regretted the U.S. reimposing Iran sanctions, wanted to save the JCPOA, even while sharing concerns about Iran's missiles and regional behavior.
And there are formal EU guidelines on promoting human rights with Gulf states, plus instances of the UK, France, Germany opposing U.S. proposals, like on Gaza.
Correct. So the report concludes these fundamental differences on human rights, multilateralism like the JCPOA. They're likely to remain friction points, making coordinated U.S.-EU Middle East policy difficult.
But the report adds a dose of realism. Europe's own economic interests and security needs, especially with conflicts nearby, might force them to find pragmatic ways to engage with the Trump administration anyway, even if it means compromising on principles sometimes.
That's the pragmatic reality acknowledged. So summing up this deep dive, we've seen a really significant shift in U.S. Middle East strategy towards more assertive transactional approach, especially comparing Trump and Biden.
Right, with tangible results like huge economic and defense deals and this push towards new alliance structures like the Middle East NATO.
But also, as the report makes clear, a lot of uncertainty remains about the long-term impact on regional stability, U.S. credibility, relationships with European allies.
And we've covered the ongoing complexities with Iran, the unclear future for Syria, and that tricky business of using energy as a foreign policy lever.
Which leaves a really big thought for you, the listener, to chew on. When you prioritize these kinds of transactional, maybe shorter-term gains in a region as volatile and crucial as the Middle East, what are the long-term trade-offs? Do those immediate benefits ultimately outweigh potential risks to stability, international norms, and the alliances that have traditionally been so important? Something to really think about.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.